Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our conversation about combating anti-Asian hate. I'm Josie Huang, and I'm so happy to be able to speak to our panel of experts and to have you join us. We're going to make sure to leave time for some of you to also ask questions of them as well. We are just so excited to hold this members-only event today. KPCC listeners are so important and cherished to us. Without you, we would not exist and be able to serve our audience with news and stories from Southern California. It is because of you, actually, that I have my job. KPCC is one of the few news organizations in the country that has a reporter dedicated to covering Asian American issues. Because of your support, I've been able to report from vigils in the San Gabriel Valley for the victims of the Atlanta shootings. I've tagged along with community volunteers walking K-Town to deter crime and to offer chaperone services. I recently talked to 5 Asian American therapists to ask their expertise on how, during this time of high stress for many Asian Americans, how to protect your mental health. I did a segment on that for our show Take Two, and also wrote a piece for LAist, allowing us to reach an even larger audience. This is on top of the other coverage about Asian American communities unrelated to the surge in hate incidents, which I really hope to be able to get back to focusing on. But from the bottom of my heart, thank you again, our KPCC listeners. Really glad you're here today. Before we launch into our conversations, I wanted to quickly explain the order of things, the structure. In planning today with KPCC's events team, we wanted to talk about how we in this country got to this place where we're seeing this rise in anti-Asian violence. We know, of course, that our former president used rhetoric that inflamed racists, but there is also a historical backstory to all this that we will be able to get into this hour. We also wanted to talk about the present. How are we addressing this crisis at the government level, but also in our communities? And lastly, we wanted to look to the future, to how we can sort through what's happening to prevent more people from getting hurt. And practically speaking, what can we, the folks on this call today, do as individuals? So essentially, we're going to break up the hour into 2 conversations that will hit upon all of this, past, present, and future. So first up, we'll be in conversation with Representative Judy Chu and historian Erika Lee. And in the second part of the hour, we'll talk to 2 people who are working on bystander training to prevent further anti-Asian attacks. That would be Christina Yang, General Counsel at Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA, which is the largest Asian American civil rights organization in Southern California. We'll also be speaking with Kelly Erickson, who's an anti-harassment trainer from the group Hollaback. And if you have questions throughout the event, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A box, which you can access by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, let's get started and kick off things with Representative Chu and historian Erika Lee. The Congresswoman does not need much introduction to our listeners. She is the Democratic representative from Pasadena, who's been representing the San Gabriel Valley for more than a decade. She's also chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. And as I mentioned, we also have with us Erika Lee. She teaches history at the University of Minnesota and is the author of some of the most comprehensive books about Asian American history, including The Making of Asian America, A History. She recently testified at the first congressional hearing on anti-Asian discrimination in 3 decades, as did Representative Chu. Thank you both for joining us. Representative Chu, I've been covering these anti-Asian attacks, since last year, the beginning of last year, and I know that you've been sounding the alarm since the very beginning, well before the horrific attacks in Atlanta in March moved anti-Asian violence really to the national spotlight. But I'm just curious, at which point did you realize last year, as someone who was paying so close attention to this, that things were only going to get worse? Was it something that our former president said, or was it a particular incident or attack or a string of attacks?
Well, first of all, thank you, Josie, for having me here, but also thank you for covering this issue from the very beginning. we knew that there were anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents. We knew right at the beginning of the coronavirus in January of last year, when Asian American businesses were starting to feel the effects of the dirty glances and the terrible rumors and the loss in patronage in their businesses. But it didn't come to a head until March. And that was when Donald Trump decided to call it the China virus, Wuhan virus, and even Kung flu. At that time, anti-Asian hate on Twitter increased by 900%. So he had an instant effect on all of that. And that's when we did see the pushing, the shoving, the stabbings, as the stabbing of that family of 3 at a Sam's Club in Texas. And it just continued on. We did press conferences, statements. We sent letters to the White House, had hearings to get Donald Trump to stop using this terminology, which the CDC and the World Health Organization said one should not use because it will cause a stigma against those of that ethnicity or from that region. And indeed it did. But Donald Trump did not pay attention. Instead, the hate crimes and incidents just continued on, increased. And in fact, we were very alarmed in March when it spread to the elderly and the vulnerable, with an 84-year-old man in San Francisco being shoved and assaulted and murdered. And a New York man who was cut from ear to ear on a New York subway, causing him to have 100 stitches. And Matthew Lung in my own district, who was sitting at a bus stop when he was attacked with a cane and then lost part of his finger. Right now, we have 3,800 hate crimes and incidents that have been documented by Stop AAPI Hate. But of course, nobody could have prepared us for the shooting of 8 people in Atlanta, with 6 of them being Asian women. That's when the nation woke up. This is when people realized this was very, very serious and horrific. And so we did see the rallies, the vigils, all kinds of actions being taken place. Thank goodness. But I have to say, it has been going on since early of last year.
Mm-hmm. And yes, the incidents that you mentioned, like the attack in San Francisco and the Filipino American man who was slashed from face to face, I think those were things that happened just this year. And Trump is out of office. He's banned from Twitter. His megaphone has been muted. He has less capacity now, or less ability to be able to set off racists, yet we see these attacks continue. Do you believe that this is because, it's just the folks who've been emboldened are emboldened now? Or do you think there's something else at play? I mean, I know that the states are opening, so as the pandemic lifts, and so these attacks are happening with greater occurrence in the same way we're seeing more mass shootings. But why do you think we are continuing to see these attacks go on unabated?
First of all, there has been a history of anti-Asian discrimination throughout history, but it's at times above the surface and at times below the surface. What Donald Trump did by using all this rhetoric was bring it way above the surface. He used his bully puppet from the very, very top, from the White House, to say these things and make it okay to actually attack people that were of AAPI descent. And the thing is, Donald Trump had a huge motive to do that. He wanted to take attention away from his failed response to the coronavirus. He also wanted to take attention away from his close relationship to Russia. So he doubled down on that. So to think of the man from the White House saying such things over and over again, it just gave people such permission to do all these ugly and horrible things against AAPIs. Of course, people in the US also were experiencing their own discomfort, panic, and anxiety about the future because of COVID. So he dug into that, and they needed somebody to blame, and they blamed AAPIs. So we are living in the aftermath of the most powerful person in the US at that time saying that it was okay to target, blame, and scapegoat AAPIs?
Professor Lee, someone who studies the history of Asian America, you know all too well that Asians in this country have been here before where they've been targeted, and the exact circumstances are different today, but at the heart of the issue is that Asians are seen as not belonging here, the perpetual foreigner, the bringer of disease. It almost seems cyclical. And I wonder, because of your expertise in this area, what does history tell you about where the current rise in anti-Asian attacks is headed? Is this going to eventually quell, only for some other crisis to arise in the future where we are asking the same questions again?
Thank you, Josie, for those great questions. And also, I need to repeat the thanks to you for your coverage. There have been a lot of journalists and a lot of media organizations that have seemingly suddenly realized that this is a story, but because you and many others have been covering the story from the very beginning, people like me and our community members have been much more well-informed. And thank you to Representative Chu for constantly fighting this battle before many other lawmakers were joining in early on in the pandemic. So, let me just bridge from what Representative Chu said. Clearly, Trump is no longer in the White House, but to further answer your question of why is this continuing under a new president who is certainly much more sympathetic and actually utters the word systemic racism in speeches like before Congress last night. These are enormously important changes from previous administrations, and certainly the most recent one. However, Trumpism, meaning the xenophobia, the anti-China rhetoric, and the racism that really he marshaled to send him to the White House, is still very much alive. Like Representative Chu said, it's like a flame that is sometimes turned down low. It never gets extinguished. Racism never gets extinguished, but sometimes turned down low, and then it takes a spark to really inflame it. So compared to other times, we have to understand that racism happens during times of peace and war, times of economic depression as well as prosperity, during times of civil rights progress and backlash. I think it's naive for us to think that the anti-Asian racism that we've seen today will simply go away with a new president, will simply go away once the pandemic is over or when things get back to normal, because we have seen this before. We have seen how certainly it may rise during times of crises, but when, for example, Japanese Americans returned home after World War II, after war was over, after Japanese American soldiers proved their patriotism over and over again, they were still met with violence and still excluded and barred. So the challenge for us at this moment is certainly to remember the long history, to remember that this is part of a pattern of systemic racism, not just towards Asian Americans, but intertwined with the other racisms and systems of oppression impacting Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color communities, and to work together to find solutions that may be unique to some communities, but also are connected to the solutions that we hope we're all working towards for to end poverty, to end racism for all of our communities.
Representative Chu, on this issue of racism, I imagine it's very hard to legislate that away, but I know you and your colleagues in Congress are trying to address this new wave, this latest wave of attacks with legislation, and that the Senate a week ago passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. Can you, tell our listeners what the bill does, and why does it have COVID-19 in the title?
So the fact that America has now woken up to this anti-Asian hate led to us finally getting the momentum to get this bill passed. And passed in the Senate. It still has to pass in the House, but it will. And it will be signed into law. So let me say it is the combination of two bills. It's the combination of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was authored by Senator Mazie Hirono and Congressmember Grace Meng. And that bill designates somebody in the Department of Justice to track the hate crimes that are occurring and make sure that they go through the system and are prosecuted. Also, it provides guidance to law enforcement on reporting hate crimes and on reaching out to culturally different populations. But this bill also includes another bill, which is called the No Hate Act, and I'm a co-lead on this bill. This bill seeks to fix our flawed hate crime system, the system where there's vast underreporting. Now, in 1990, a federal law was passed to require the FBI to track and tabulate hate crimes nationally, but it is extremely flawed because they only can rely voluntarily on local law enforcement to give them the statistics. And guess what? Of the 15,000 local law enforcement agencies, only 15% even report anything at all. So this bill provides for consistency in the reporting of hate crimes. It provides grants to local law enforcement so that they can get training, adopt policies, get a program together to address hate crimes. It provides for the creation of state-run hate crime hotlines for victims so that they can also possibly get the help they need. And it provides for oversight with the U.S. Attorney General identifying how many states have adopted hate crime policies, the quality of the hate crime data collection, and the degree to which they are conducting hate crime trainings. And they have to give this report to us on an annual basis.
It was mentioned in President Biden's address that this particular piece of legislation got overwhelming support with only one nay, and that he was very eager to sign it. Professor Lee, unlike the work we're hearing about from Representative Chu on the federal level, where you do have a president who is sympathetic to what's going on right now with the wave of attacks on Asians and Asian Americans, the US government in the past was often actively working against Asian Americans. I've learned from reading your work. Can you tell us briefly about how the US government itself used to target Asian residents?
It's a function of the ways in which politics and racism can work together. There's racist sentiment, there's racial violence. It's often been promoted by lawmakers in order to get into office. We've seen, Dustin, with the past administration, how effective xenophobia can be in getting people to the polls, to vote, to support certain legislation. It's an unfortunate fact of our history. And so in the past, we've seen that Congress and our lawmakers at the state and local level have often justified or legalized some of the racism that has been expressed in the streets by passing discriminatory immigration bans, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, or through diplomatic agreements as well, which bar Japanese and Korean laborers through the Gentleman's Agreement. And then, of course, we know about the forced relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. So we do have a very unfortunate history of racism at all of our levels of government that has helped to then, I think, further justify and promote the continuation of some of the racial violence that we've seen in recent months.
I want to take this moment to say to our audience, if you have questions for Representative Chu or Professor Lee, please just feel free to drop those in the Q&A box, which you can do so by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Professor Lee, some of the darkest chapters in Asian American history took place right here in LA that I've learned about right in our backyard. Of course, you mentioned the incarceration of thousands of Californians of Japanese descent at camps. Some, I understand, were first detained at the Santa Anita racetrack in Arcadia, which is in Representative Chu's district, of course, and also the Pomona Fairplex. But less known is about an even earlier event that turned out to be one of the country's worst mass lynchings right here in what is now downtown LA. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, so you're talking about the 1871 massacre. It's a period when, LA is really just developing. There's around 5,000 people in the greater LA area, and there's less than 180 people of Chinese descent in LA. Like other communities, it's a community that is poor. It's largely working class. They're crowded together in not so much tenements, but housing units that have many people in them. There's conflict that often results in those kinds of impoverished conditions. And in 1869, 70, and 71, there were some internal feuds that spilled out into the streets one day in 1871. Police were called. One police officer was shot, a bystander was wounded. And in a context of growing anti-Chinese racism in the press, newspapers like the LA News or the LA Star penning editorials talking about Chinese immigration being a danger, attacking Chinese people as immoral or inferior. These internal feuds, and certainly the tragic loss of life, became a spark to the flame. Pretty soon there were 500 Angelenos who were dragging Chinese out of their homes, dragging them down the street to a location where other Angelenos were building makeshift gallows. And over a period of 24 hours, 18 were hung. This is the largest mass lynching in US history. And it's such a shame that we gloss over these episodes. We gloss over this history. Our school children are simply not taught not just about these horrific acts of violence and how they continue to target Asian Americans up to the present, but also the resistance, the struggles, the civil rights struggles that generations of Asian Americans have been engaged in. Long before we had political representation in Congress, these struggles had to happen on the streets and in the courts and in our own communities. So I hope that is one legacy out of this new awakening that so many have around Asian American issues, that we remember not only what was done to us, but also what we did and what we are doing today.
This issue of educating or providing more education about Asian American history in schools was actually something I did want to ask both of you about, because Representative Chu, you're championing legislation which is intended to improve the reporting of hate crimes and attain justice for victims, which is very critical. But where else, or what other fronts do you think there needs to be work done? I've seen different ideas, such as requiring more Asian American history in schools to familiarize students about the contributions that Asians have made in this country. Not to mention the hardships they faced, but I've seen other ideas like from Andrew Yang, who is of course the former presidential candidate turned New York mayoral candidate, who wrote a very controversial op-ed about how Asian Americans can combat hate with basically kindness by being more neighborly and volunteering more. And while others say the onus should to stop hate should be on everyone. So what say you, Representative Chu? What else would you like to see happen besides just trying to stop and prevent hate crimes?
Well, the other side of the story is that we need to educate all of America as to what the Asian American population is all about, our history, as well as the diversity, because there are many people who are not Asian that don't realize that we have so many different sub-ethnic groups, and there's such a vast difference between the economic and the educational situation with, say, Pacific Islanders and Southeast Asians versus Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans. That's why we always push for disaggregated data that will break it all down. But that is a lesson that needs to be taught to everybody, and that education needs to be done. Of course, we support bills that are requiring ethnic studies in our K-12 as well as in our college systems. And I know those bills are going through, but we on the federal level are supporting curriculums that we can develop on the federal level as a model. We are supporting a Smithsonian Museum for Asian American history. We are supporting diversity in the media so that there are more accurate portrayals of Asian Americans in the media. And finally, we are starting to see a breakthrough, like with films like Minari, finally, a full-fledged depiction of an Asian American family that is not stereotypical. So these kinds of true portrayals can really help, and we can do so much on all these different levels to have a full-bodied view of Asian Americans, which is something we should do with all populations in the United States.
Thanks for that. I just want to squeeze in one more question for myself before we move into some questions from the audience. But something I've noticed, Representative Chu, is that there's been a lot of solidarity between lawmakers, amongst lawmakers of color, when it on the Hill when it comes to fighting anti-Asian hate. And in LA, I was at an anti-hate rally in Koreatown, which I believe you spoke at, where Black and Latino politicians, LA County Supervisors Mark Ridley Thomas and Holly Mitchell, they spoke up against the attacks on Asians and blamed white supremacy. But at the same time, the surge in violence against Asians has opened a conversation about race relations between minorities because of some of the high profile hate crimes in major cities. Not so much, I think, in LA, but more from incidents captured on surveillance camera in New York and San Francisco that involve Black perpetrators, and online at least, because I follow Asian Twitter and Black Twitter, that's led to discussion, sometimes angry discussion, about longstanding tensions between the Black and Asian communities. I watched a Zoom conversation you held Tuesday with the son of one of the Atlanta shooting victims, Young Ayu, who her son is Robert Peterson, who because he is Black and Korean, he was able to make a point of addressing racial bias from his particular vantage point. Can you talk about what he told you, and what your take on this current conversation about Asian-Black relations is? Are you worried about fissures, I guess?
Yeah, first of all, let me say, each of us gets to bring a guest at the State of the Union, and of course, this time it was all virtual, but my virtual guest was in fact Robert Peterson, because I wanted to make sure that we do not forget these 8 victims in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the son of one of the Korean women that was shot at the Asian spa. And he talked so movingly about what it was like when he could not get an answer back on the cell phone and suspected it might be her, and then how he felt when he drove to the spa and saw that it was her car and he knew she was dead, and what she was like as a woman who loved to cook Korean food and sing karaoke and always had a smile, and in fact was a greeter for that Asian spa. But the other interesting thing is his talk about how she raised him in a biracial way, because he is half Black and half Asian. And she made sure that both sides of his identity were appreciated, that he learned about both sides of him. And so he's a very confident young man, I must tell you. So she did a very, very good job with him. And he said that whenever somebody would say something disparaging about Blacks to his mother, he would say, "Don't you say that I have a Black son and that whenever somebody said something disparaging about Asians to him, he said, "Don't you dare say that. I have an Asian mother."
And how is that something, I mean, he was encouraging the public to also intervene when they see bigotry in their midst. But I wanted to ask Representative Chu if you think this dialogue about about Asian-Black relations as it relates to these anti-Asian attacks, are you concerned that it will lead to just fissures and just more tensions?
I am so encouraged by the dialogue that is taking place, though, amongst leaders. I mean, actually, I do have to tell you that we in the Tri-Caucus have a very close relationship, and we have fought for each other's issues to the greatest degree we can. So we in the Congressional Asian Pacific Caucus immediately spoke out against the George Floyd killing, and also have fully backed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. When the anti-Asian hate crimes were occurring, the Tri-Caucus was the first to come and support us in our efforts. And I think that it is up to us leaders to be role models, to show that we have this dialogue, that we join hands together. It's so important for us to speak out, but speak out together. And I do actually see more models of that out in the public than ever. I am, in fact, amazed by the number of rallies, vigils, online events that have been multiracial. So I do think there actually is a movement there where people are saying, we need to link hands now. We need to speak out. We need to make this in America where everybody feels included.
I'm going to stop monopolizing you guys' time right now and switch over to some questions from the audience. And I have one question that is from Han Tran, and it relates to children. So I'm going to turn to Erika, Professor Lee, the historian here. Han Tran writes, "My concern is that we are considered the invisible minority. We teach our children to respect elders, and the rules we teach them that it's disrespectful to express an opinion that does not align with our elders. We teach our children not to create waves. How do we find the balance between our cultural beliefs on respect with that of making our voices heard with respect to racism?" Is this something that your students have asked you about?
Oh, sure. And I would like to just echo a point that you have just been finishing talking about, and that is about the enormous range of cross-racial interfaith solidarity that we've seen, not just this past year, not just in the wake of George Floyd, but also I think in the past several years, where there have been numerous issues around immigration, for example, that have brought out lots of different communities. So going back to Hans' question about how can we perhaps maintain some of our cultural values while also speaking out against racism? And I think that our cultural values, regardless of which culture we're from, do not respect unfairness, do not respect bullies, do not respect those who would seek to divide us and to treat others unequally. So there is an important lesson that I think crosses across cultural boundaries, and it is about just basic human fairness and what is right and what is wrong. When we teach our children from the very beginning, we read them books and we talk about fairness and we talk about being kind. And I don't think that those are lessons that contradict any cultural values that also talk about respecting our elders. When our elders are perhaps not doing things that support basic human values, I think that's it's important to talk about that and how you can respect and your traditions, but also speak out when it's wrong, because I do think that is part of our traditions as well.
Yes, and that's something that I've noticed a lot of folks have been reminding each other of is the history of Asian Americans standing up for not just themselves, but other marginalized groups. I wish we had more time for that, but I want to get in some more questions from, I think maybe just time for one more question. This one I will pose to you, Representative Chu, because I know this is something that you have been concerned about. This question is from Christopher, and he is referring to the comments made by the sheriff's department outside Atlanta about how the shooter was having a bad day. And they've seen it, Christopher writes, we've seen it in some other local school announcements around anti-Asian violence. Example, let's try to forgive the culprit and reform them. This continues to water everything down, the seriousness and outrage. What are you doing? And I guess you've told us what you're doing, but what can the public do to help combat this watering down of what, in the case of the Atlanta shootings, many see as a very obvious hate crime? Christopher says, I faced racist taunts all the time. While this was not life-threatening, it does kill a small piece of you every time it does happen.
Oh, my goodness, Christopher, what a question. But actually, I took what was happening in Cherokee County to heart, because I was horrified by the response of the sheriffs. I could not believe that they said that the shooter had a sex addiction and a bad day. And it outraged me so much that I organized a congressional delegation to Atlanta. Not only did we meet with the victims and the API community, but I made it a deliberate thing to have us trace the steps of the shooter so that we could see with our own eyes and with our own car that he started at a spa called Young's Asian Massage, that he drove 27 miles to a place that had 2 Asian spas right next to each other. And by shooting into those spas the way he did, it was very clear he was going to shoot Asian women. What could not be clear as far as it being a hate crime? And so I have pushed very, very hard for this to be investigated as a hate crime. I am really concerned because the Cherokee County sheriffs have their own attitudes. And they also probably have very little experience prosecuting hate crimes, because the Georgia hate crime law was only instituted a year prior. And so actually, I wrote a letter to the Department of Justice urging an independent investigation for them to utilize all the resources possible to find the evidence that would declare it a hate crime. Basically, words matter. And the words of the Cherokee County Sheriff diminished the nature of these crimes. But words matter in general for anybody to denigrate what they have said, if despite the fact that it might be a terrible slur, is not right. And we have to take them seriously. Those words have consequences and can have all kinds of terrible, long-lasting traumatic experiences. And it's also, though, to have everybody speak out and to take these kinds of comments seriously, and for everybody to know that words have consequences, that we have to treat each other with respect if we're ever to become an inclusive society.
Thank you to the audience for those questions. I know we had a few others we couldn't get to, but just ran out of time. I apologize. And I want to thank Representative Judy Chu for your time, and also Professor Erika Lee too. Both been awesome. At this time, we will bid you adieu. We know you have busy schedules and other engagements. So again, thank you so much. Our gratitude for talking to me and to our KPCC members.
Thank you, Josie.
Take care. I'd like to speed ahead into the second part of our conversation that looks at how we as individuals, the folks on this call, myself included, how we can prevent or mitigate bad situations when it comes to Asians or others who are being targeted or bullied for their race. Attack after attack captured on video. You've seen Asians targeted because they're elderly or because they're women and smaller, and no one intervenes. And at least one attack in LA, someone was attacked for just passing as Asian. Earlier this month in Eagle Rock, a Latina woman had her nose broken by someone shouting anti-Asian slurs at her because the assailant assumed that the victim was Asian. Again, in that situation, no one stepped in to help. So I want to now reintroduce our two other guests, Christina Yang, who is General Counsel at Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA. And also, hello, and Kelly Erickson, she's a training director from Hollaback, an anti-harassment training nonprofit. Thank you both so much for joining us. So I'll just start off with Christina. Working at the region's largest Asian American civil rights org, you've been tracking anti-Asian attacks, and just this year alone, there's been a number of disturbing events across the region. Can you tell us some about the ones that have been on your radar?
Yeah, thanks, Josie, and thank you to KPCC for having us. I think, we have really seen an increase, even I think before the last couple of months, where there seems to be a lot more attention from everybody on the attacks that we've heard about. And I'm thinking in particular, even of ones that, may not necessarily rise to a particular level of physical violence, but are really disturbing nonetheless. I think after the Atlanta murders, for instance, there were a number of rallies and actions that our organization and community members and allies were participating in. And I remember hearing about one in particular out in Diamond Bar last month, where there was a multi-ethnic, multiracial group of supporters leaving a large rally that occurred, and a vehicle driving very quickly, kind of came through the crosswalk very suddenly, nearly hitting folks as they were trying to leave the rally, shouting various racial epithets. And I think those are the sorts of things that are, of course, really disturbing to us at our organization, and also lead us to think, what can we really do about these continued incidents that we keep hearing about all around the Southland and across the country, unfortunately.
And in some of the incidents that I've been following, I've noticed that bystanders do not intervene, and which is, why your two organizations have partnered up to create a program. But before we get into what that program will do exactly, I'm curious, Kelly, are we seeing the so-called bystander effect that you hear about in Psych 101, where you think other people are going to jump in, but then everybody thinks that, and then nobody does anything, or what is going on here that can explain video after video of bystanders doing nothing?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having me. There's a lot of different reasons why people are concerned about intervening, and they include the bystander effect, which essentially shows that the more people that stand around and see what's going on and do nothing, the less likely anybody is to intervene. There's also thoughts about fears or concerns. What if it turns on me? What if I share the identity with the person who's experiencing the harassment in that moment? What if I make it worse? What if I don't know what's going on? Like, I don't have enough context. So I think too, and in this moment, we're coming out of this global pandemic, but it's really affected all of us. And so people are more stressed generally. There's been concerns just generally in life, like this is a new normal, but it's not normal. And so everybody brings all of that with them as they experience the world. And so it's easy when we see something happening to have to freeze and not know what to do. And so all of those make a lot of sense in the moment, and bystander intervention methodologies are really designed to help us overcome that so that we can take it from our heads, like we learn things through the program that you mentioned, move it into our hearts and bodies so that we can be prepared and empowered to act when we see things happening.
Yeah, so I know that, because of all these attacks on Asians across the country, there's been tens of thousands of people who have taken it upon themselves to get bystander training. I think often from Hollaback is one organization I keep on hearing about over and over. And I know that Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA has, sister groups who have launched this in their cities. Christina, can you talk about what you guys are going to start doing in LA?
Yeah, we're really excited to be following in the footsteps of our affiliates in Chicago, DC, and San Francisco, and launching our own training program based here in Southern California. And I think, given that we're kind of still in pandemic and still using virtual platform for now, what's really great about the virtual trainings that does allow us to reach a large number of folks in lots of different places all around LA. With the preview sessions that we've already started doing last week, and actually right now there's one going on, and we have a couple more in the coming weeks before we formally launch our program the week of May 17th. We have 12 staff, and 3 of our CBO partners have staff as well that will be undergoing Hollaback's amazing Train the Trainers curriculum. Kelly actually is one of our principal trainers that will be working with us next week and getting us all situated to formally launch our own program. And so we're really excited to have the capacity to offer more trainings that are both free to the public as well as for various groups that want to have their own private closed trainings also.
And Christina, if folks on this call want to, sign up, is it available for signups yet? And where do they go?
Yes, I have a short link that our comms team has shared with me. It's bit.ly/bystanderLA, and that's all one word. And that'll take you to our Advancing Justice LA website, where you can sign up and get your Zoom link for our upcoming sessions that still have spots available.
And, we got to chat a little bit earlier about this program. And so I learned from you that many corporations and white collar workers are interested in getting trained on bystander training. Of course, you want to reach a wider population. How will you attempt to do this?
Thanks, Josie. Yeah, I'm really excited, especially as we do emerge from the pandemic, about our ability to go to an in-person model that'll allow us to reach more vulnerable community members who, either may not have access to technology to do the Zoom webinars, or just may not be able to navigate it due to language barriers, for example. So we are looking to provide the trainings in different Asian languages later this year. We're going to be starting with Chinese and Korean first, and then launching to other Asian languages and dialects as well after that. And we're really hoping to focus on communities like senior citizens, as I think many of us have heard. A lot of the really disturbing attacks have been on vulnerable elderly members of AAPI communities. So we're looking to definitely provide these, the 5Ds and the Hollaback toolkit to them so that they feel empowered within their own communities. Also, we've been talking a lot about making the training accessible to kids in schools as local schools are reopening. We have been hearing from parents and others, including teachers and principals, who are concerned about whether or not kids who identify as AAPI might be worried about bullying or just increased incidents of anti-Asian hate as they go back to learning on campus, where they haven't been for the most part over the last year plus, and kind of also the anxieties around what we've all been reading about in the news at the same time, and wanting them to feel like their community of students and peers will be able to stand up for them as bystanders if the time comes.
That's right, because we're hearing reports from all over the country that Asian American parents are keeping their kids at home even as the pandemic lifts and schools are starting to open completely, or at least go to a hybrid model. And it reminds me that early in the pandemic in LA, one of the first reports of violence that I reported on was how an Asian American middle schooler, I think in the Valley, was physically assaulted. So Christina, you mentioned the 5Ds, and I do want to get to that, but I also wanted to just say to our audience, if anybody has a question, to please go ahead and drop it in our Q&A section over there. But I do want to talk about this mnemonic, the 5Ds that I keep on hearing about. I've heard variations. I think different organizations, maybe I've heard the 3Ds, the 5Ds. Clearly, Hollaback goes with the 5Ds. And I know this is not a full training, but Kelly, could you tell us what these 5Ds are, so we could get a taste of what would be learning more about in these trainings?
Yeah, so I'd love to give you a little preview of what you're going to learn. First, bystander intervention as a principle has been around kind of since, I don't know, the dawn of time, I would say. It's this concept of people helping people in times of need. But somehow when it's harassment, we freeze or have concerns and we don't know what to do. And so the methodology that Hollaback has developed and been using now for almost 10 years formally is the 5 Ds that have been mentioned. And the concept or goal is to empower individuals with these tools, hopefully highly memorable with the 5 Ds, right? So that we can remember these and find one that works in every situation. So let me introduce you. The Hollaback's 5 Ds of bystander intervention start with distract. So distract is the first D. Essentially, this is creating some kind of distraction to de-escalate the situation. You are creating a distraction that's either unrelated to the person who's experiencing it, or you could pretend like you know them. You could just say, hey, you're ready to get out of here, or you could ask for directions. You could drop something. Sometimes we say you can, I don't know, accidentally on purpose spill your water. Something that breaks that moment and that creates a little bit of space. You're not engaging with the person who's doing the harassment. So distract is the first one. The next D is delegate. This is essentially getting help from somebody else to intervene. You may feel like it's, for whatever reason, it's not you in that moment to do anything directly if you don't feel safe. You might have your kids with you, or who knows what. You're just don't feel like you can intervene, you can still do something. So a lot of times people think of calling authorities. However, we suggest you always check in with the person who's experiencing the harassment before you call the police. The whole point is to help, and calling the police doesn't always make everyone feel safe. So of course, always use your best judgment on that, but delegate's just finding someone to help. It could be the person right next to you, another bystander who also sees what's happening. You can just kind of look at them or say, hey, do you feel like you can jump in? And then maybe you can employ one of the other interventions. Document is the next one. And a lot of the incidents that we have seen in the news and in social media is because someone has documented. And so there are ways that you will learn how to document and be safe in doing so, and some even tips and tricks, because documentation can be actually very supportive and helpful. The next D is delay, which, you know, sometimes things happen so quickly, it's over. So the harassment happens, everyone stands there and there's this awkward moment. What do? You can still make a difference. So delay is simply checking in with the person who experienced the harassment and asking them, telling them, I saw what happened and that was not okay. And are you all right? Is there any way that I can support you? It can be very validating, and even so much as a knowing glance or a smile can actually help the way people process trauma or disrespect or microaggressions, those things that happen. And lastly is direct. There's a reason that direct is last, because it's usually the one people think of first. And direct is the only of the 5 Ds that's actually directed toward the person who's doing the harassment. So this could be some version of, hey, stop doing that. You step in, you set a clear boundary, and then don't engage with the person. You just set that boundary and then kind of ignore them, and you can still check in with the person who's experiencing the behavior. It could also be asking a clarifying question directly to the person about the harassment, but you're saying something like, when you said this, what did you mean by that? Because sometimes what we're hoping, if we want to end harassment in all of its forms, is we need everybody at some point. And so you give them a chance to maybe think about what they said or self-correct. But the key thing there, and you'll learn safe ways to do that in the training, is you're not there to engage in the back and forth. Remember, you're there to help the person who experienced the behavior. So those are the 5 Ds: distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct.
Yeah.
How's that for a preview?
That's a great Cliff Notes. You don't have to do the training anymore, just kidding.
We're done.
It sounds like also folks will have to be using their common sense about their safety, given that every situation is going to be different. I do hear more and more amongst my Asian American female friends, actually, of them taking on, ordering pepper spray, or like people I've interviewed who have bought tasers and even guns. And I mean, it starts to get pretty hairy there, but it sounds like you have to assess your level of safety and comfort in whatever one of those decisions, but having at least like a framework to work with, you're less in like panic mode and trying to figure out what to do. I had mentioned earlier that I had interviewed therapists about mental health in relation to these Asian American attacks, and they said a lot of the what they're hearing from folks is that because they're not prepared for an event like this, they often don't react the way they might want to. And then what's worse is just the feeling of disempowerment afterwards because you didn't do what you wish you could have done. Yes, okay. I just realized we're running low on time, so I will have one last quick question and then switch over to a audience question. But I'm curious, Kelly, as to these different techniques you've just went over with us, would they also work in the case of the person who's actually being targeted? I mean, I personally have, I feel like my awareness level has been heightened, covering this, but just I think anybody who's been following the news is wondering, how do I react? So can any of this be like adapted?
Sure. So the 5 Ds work from the bystander perspective across all sorts of harassment for sure. And even at the lowest levels of disrespect, the earlier we can hit it on that spectrum of disrespect, the more we'll start to chip away at that culture that makes these behaviors seem normal and okay. There's another approach to when it happens to you, like the how do I respond? And so, yes, these can work. We teach a methodology that's slightly different that involves, of course, observing what's happening, checking in with yourself, seeing how escalated you are, checking your safety, and also establishing some boundaries, like connecting with your space, creating a little bit of space. And then part of that too, we teach about practicing resilience, because in this world, when these things are happening, continue to happen, we need everyone's leadership, and we need everyone to get up in the day and keep going. And so being able to learn how to and consistently practice resilience is part of that too. But certainly a lot of strategies will be shared that will give participants opportunities as bystanders, as well as when harassment happens to them. And if I may, as a last note, I just want to say that there's no perfect response to harassment, and harassment is never your fault. So please don't look back with the coulda, woulda, shouldas, and don't add guilt to the situation we're already in, but use that only to the degree, I would say, that it helps you moving forward, and come to a training with Advancing Justice LA and Hollaback and get some new tools.
Yeah, that actually reminds me again from that conversation I had with mental health therapists, where they said, it's not your fault that whatever happened. And, the worst feeling afterwards is when people around you are standing there and see what happened and don't acknowledge it. And this one particular therapist, Lance Tango of Pasadena, was saying, what you can do in that situation, which can feel actually quite surprisingly empowering, is to say to the folks around you, did you see what just happened? Did you see how racist that was? And by doing that, you aren't just shouldering that burden by yourself anymore. This is something that happened to everybody who was there at the moment. So
and being able to step up and ask for help in that moment, because generally bystanders want to help, they don't always know how. So try to help them.
So we are at the 1 hour mark already, if you can believe it, at the end of our conversation. And it's been a really great discussion, and you guys squeezed, Christina and Kelly squeezed so much in the little time that we had. Thank you, Christina Yang of Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA, and Kelly Erickson of Hollaback for joining us today. Thank you so much to the events team, Rebecca Stumi, Tony Frederico, and John Cohn. Most importantly, thank you, KPCC members, for taking time out of your afternoon, a Thursday afternoon, beautiful, lovely day outside, to share this hour with us. It means a lot to us at KPCC, and we hope it was a good use of your time. So please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.